secure system you can think of. Yeah, no. So I hear all kinds of things when I ask this question. One of the answers that I hear is Linux or Microsoft. Okay, well, I never hear Microsoft, but Apple or once we get beyond talking about the OSs, because every one of those options or every one of those technologies is actually hackable, including Cisco routers, including switches. Everything is hackable. So then you get down to the next level, which is, okay, fine, we're going to take the system and we're going to put it inside of a locked room. Okay, that's fine. Who has keys to that locked room? Can they still gain it? Can anybody gain access? And do we trust everybody? My father was in the movie theater industry, and he was in charge. He worked for a chain of theaters, and his main job was finding theft in theaters. And believe it or not, there's a lot of theft that goes on. But he once told me, he said, never trust anybody 100%. And sometimes you don't even trust yourself because there's temptation. So again, I ask, who's got keys? Where are the spare keys? So, okay, fine. Dale, if they get into the room, we'll know about they get into the room. Well, that's really great. I was actually, I have a friend, and I'm using air quotes right now. I have a friend who was involved with a penetration test at a bank. And my friend showed up to the branch with a new Blade server and announced that he was there. He was running late. He needed to install this, that it was there to... or the new server is going to make things work really fast, and he pretended like it was very heavy so they would hurry up, and sure enough, they hurried up and let him into the server room. Well, while my friend was in the server room, they left him alone, and so my friend did all kinds of fun things. Obviously, my friend had a contract with this particular company or this particular bank, and my friend went through and saw a shelf of tape backups, and so he very easily put tape backups into his duffel bag. He also went ahead and deployed the server. The server actually was nothing special except for it was a backdoor into their network. While he was at it, he grabbed some hard drives that were sitting off to the side that looked like they were for hot spares, or maybe they were older drives that possibly still had data on them. So even at the hardware level, we have an issue as far as what is the most secure system. The answer I usually say, and I know this is going to throw some of you guys, but it's typically the one that's never built. Because no matter what you do, there's always some type of entry into that system, whether it's you, and of course somebody can impersonate you. And trust me, even as careful as I am today, I'm still shocked sometimes the things that I go, oh crap, I can't believe I just did that. I gave out that particular piece of information. So one thing I like to get across to all my students is this, and this is really, really hard for some people to accept, but trust me, you're going to have to accept this, and that is you can't stop them. I don't care what new hardware devices you have, what you have in place. If there's not a digital hack, there's a physical hack. There's a social engineering hack. Your job is not to stop them. Your job is to discourage, misdirect, and slow them down, them being the attackers. And again, this is a extremely difficult thing to recognize and realize as an IT guy, because we like to think that we're infallible, because everybody thinks that we're infallible, right? The other thing is that you have against you is time. Time is not on your side. A hacker has all the time in the world. You are busy doing other things for your company or looking for different vulnerabilities, or you're busy doing other things, and you don't work 24/7. Hackers can set up botnets to do things for them 24/7. So when we see things like, it's going to take X amount of days for somebody to hack brute force a password, trust me, time is on their side. There's one more thing you need to understand, and that is the attacker only has to find one opening. Your dilemma is that you have to find all of the openings and make sure that they're covered. And again, the reason why we can't stop them is just when you think you get everything covered, a new vulnerability comes up because there's been an update to an OS or an update to a application or an update to drivers. So grasping that, we need to understand how hackers operate and how you should operate. Now, when it comes to understand how they operate, you need to grasp that hackers don't, or hacking attackers don't actually accomplish everything in a single stage. They actually go through what we refer to as phases. And along each step of these phases, the attacker learns something about your environment. Some of it can be beneficial to them. Some of them is just like, okay, I got it. So we're going to go through and take a look at each one of these phases. The first phase we'll go through and take a look at is reconnaissance. Then we'll go through and take a look at scanning. After we scan, the next thing an attacker does is he goes through and tries to gain access. If he is successful in gaining access, his next step is to maintain access to that system. And then finally, his last phase that he goes through is clears his tracks or covers his tracks to make sure that people don't see that he's been in there. Now, each one of these phases will get more in depth with additional courses here at Pluralsight. We'll have one complete course on reconnaissance. We also refer to it as footprinting. We have a whole separate course coming up that is just about scanning, one about gaining access, maintaining access, clearing the tracks. All these things we'll be covering. This, again, is designed to be, you've heard me say it before, a 10,000-foot view. So let's take a look at phase one, which is reconnaissance. Now, when we hear about reconnaissance, we typically have an image like this, right? Recon. So it's very similar. When it comes to reconnaissance, what we're talking about here is actually looking at a target, trying to figure out who the target is going to be and what they might have to offer. It is a phase that the attacker actually prepares everything else that he's going to do based off the information that he acquires during this phase. Now, this phase is done in two different methods. The first method is referred to as passive, and the other one is referred to as an active reconnaissance. So passive reconnaissance, active reconnaissance. And I love this picture because it sums it up. A passive reconnaissance is where you have no direct interaction with the target, and that would be the equivalent of a sniper's spotter. He has the binoculars, he gathers information, the target has no idea that he's looking at him. The active version of reconnaissance is where you have direct interaction with the target. And trust me, that would be the sniper's role. He will have direct interaction. It's the same thing when it comes to reconning on networks or a target. Typically, this is a phase that we'll go through. We'll be scanning the network, either from an internal perspective or an external perspective. And typically, again, this is done without any type of authorization. Now, normally, passive reconnaissance is not illegal. Let me give you an example of that. If I was to go to the company's webpage and look at their website, maybe go to their job openings, see what kind of positions are available, that's pretty passive. There's nothing wrong with what I just did. Now, reconnaissance is also the phase that is the most time-consuming for the attacker, but it also has a big payoff. Again, he's going to try to learn as much about your company as he can. Now, part of reconnaissance may actually include things like social engineering. If you're not familiar with what social engineering is, we have a whole module coming up on that one, but just give you a quick, brief summary of it. It is the ability to manipulate somebody by almost being a con man, getting people to expose information about themselves that they normally wouldn't expose. Great example for me when it comes to social engineering is I go to Sam's Club. Some of you guys may go to Costco. And if you don't have those, maybe it's just a grocery store. But when I go on the Saturdays, they always have these people out there giving out free samples, right? Like, little pieces of beef jerky or little pieces of burritos. That's totally designed to socially engineer you. First of all, the aspect of social engineering that they're drawing out of you is one based off of emotion or guilt. Here you've got someone who's prepared the food. She's cutting it up, or he or she may be cutting it up. They're serving you. You come over. You're getting something for free, and they want to tell you about it, and they do it really well to me. I'm going to be the first to admit here. My wife makes fun of me all the time because, usually it's some grandma that's telling me all about this particular bacon, and I'm like, the bacon's good. And I will actually grab a pack of the bacon, put it in my cart, walk around the aisle, and find another refrigerated section and put it back. So, social engineering works everywhere. Folks in marketing are typically masters of social engineering, at least if they're any good. Another type of reconnaissance that a attacker might use would be looking up information about you on the internet. For example, they could use the Whois database, or I could actually very quickly and easily do an NS lookup and find out what type of email server that you're using. Dumpster diving is another type of reconnaissance that we can do, and I know that sounds kind of weird, right? You're not looking for food. But getting information such as bank statements, ATM slips, phone numbers. Matter of fact, I always laughed back in the day when you wanted to go get a driver's license, or when you wanted to get a new driver's license because you lost your old one. What did they always ask you for ID? Where I live, they'd say, well, bring us a bill with your current address, like your water bill. And I'm like, couldn't anybody just show up with that and say, my name is Dale? Thank heavens now most of our DMV departments now have digital photos of the old license so they can compare and see if you actually look like Dale, or if you're trying to gain access to my driver's license. Now, there is nothing illegal about dumpster diving. In fact, back in the early, I want to say it was back in the 90s when the Department of Justice was going after Microsoft for their practices when it came to Internet Explorer. Sun Microsystems actually did some dumpster diving on the Microsoft campus to get information that they then presented, showing that Microsoft had some dealings under the table that weren't necessarily above board, shall we say. Now, from an attacker's point of view, we're a big fan of passive reconnaissance. We're not really big fans of active. And let me give you an example of an active reconnaissance technique. If I was to ping your server, that's pretty active, right? I'm actually reaching out and touching your server. Is there a trail? Possibly. So active reconnaissance is usually only used when the attacker has figured out or is making an assumption that there's a very low probability that the activities or the tasks he's about to do, a ping, an NS lookup, whatever the case may be, whether anybody's looking at that or not. Our script kiddies have this tendency of being a little more active than they should be. They end up using tools that could actually be a little more aggressive than a simple ping. So as an ethical hacker, you have to have the ability to be aware of all of these various reconnaissance techniques and also be able to help implement preventative techniques as different threats arise. Scanning. Scanning is the phase where an attacker actually goes through and tries to figure out as much as you can. This is a little bit more active. There is some passive scanning as well. But my goal here in the scanning technique is to go through and gather as much information, see if I can identify your operating systems. And believe it or not, that can be done through just normal traffic. It's kind of interesting that Linux boxes respond to certain types of network traffic a specific way versus an Apple computer responds a different way versus a Microsoft OS, which responds a completely different way. So I want to go through and I want to see if I can identify those systems using I'm going to try first using some passive scanning techniques. And a passive scanning technique would be something like just sniffing the traffic. I'm not actually touching anybody. I'm just sniffing so I can identify the machines that are out there that are talking. An active scan would be me doing a ping sweep. Now, I also want to be able to not only map out systems, but I also want to be able to map out other hardware devices. I want to be able to see if I can detect where firewalls are, where routers are. If I can discover the IP address scheme that you're using, many times I can go through and say, okay, it looks like he's using the first 100 IP addresses of this subnet for network devices and the last 50 of that subnet for printers. Well, that just tells me which targets I can stay clear of and which targets I can just completely ignore. Now, believe it or not, there are some very, very easy tools out there that I can use, such as a simple trace route or even a path ping. There's also some other tools that we'll get into, and when we get into the scanning course, CHIOPS, which is actually a management tool, but attackers will use that technology to try to scan your network and ID your systems. So after I've gone through and ID'd all my nodes or devices on my network, based off of the results that I get back, if it's a Windows machine or a Linux machine or whatever the OS may be or hardware device may be, I'm going to start looking for vulnerabilities. And this is actually where when we talk about making sure that you have a great understanding of vulnerability research comes into play, because things are changing continuously. If you don't know about the latest and greatest, you may look at something and go, oh, that's just our Cisco access point that's sitting out there and it's okay. Well, guess what? There may be a zero-day attack out there on that particular router, and there may be a vulnerability. Now, after we gather that information, the next thing we want to do is use some tools. And what we're going to do with these tools is we're going to try to expose as much information as we can. And the types of tools that we'll use will be like a port scanner that's going to go through and look at ports that may be opened up by services. And one of the ways that you protect yourself from this type of scan is to make sure that services aren't running on machines that shouldn't be running. They have no business running on those machines. And we're going to do that by doing some proper auditing of systems. Another type of tool that we'll be using will be a vulnerability scanner. And again, by the way, these tools, again, are used by the attackers, not only by you, but also by attackers. And typically they're ripped off or pirated. But we're going to go through and see what vulnerabilities. Really, some really nice software out there that goes through and tells me as a network admin, hey, all my the following machines don't have the latest service pack installed for Windows 7 or Windows 8.1. Those same type of scanners, attackers are going to run on your network to see if they can figure out where their entry point is. And if you haven't invested in one of these vulnerability scanners for your own network, I highly recommend that you find a solution that meets the needs of your company, because trust me, if you're not scanning for the vulnerabilities, somebody else who shouldn't be is to try to get into your network. Gaining access. When it comes to gaining access, what we're talking about here is the attacker figuring out a path into your network infrastructure. And he's going to look at things such as getting in via your network, getting in via an operating system, or even possibly via an application. This is typically one of the most important phases of the attack in the terms of where damage can be done, because sometimes trying to gain access, the attacker can cause some damage. Sometimes doing something like a denial of service attack, it's not necessarily to deny service, it's to cause something to take place, an overload, if you will, on that particular machine so that I can then gain access. One of the most famous tools that we'll be talking about in one of the other courses here will be Metasploit, which is designed to, in most cases, overload a system to expose a vulnerability. And that would be our method of gaining access. Now, there are different factors that can actually affect the chances of an attacker getting into your getting into the target system, which would include configuration of the target system, the skills of the attacker, the architecture, as well as the initial permissions that are given to a user when access is obtained. Now, once we gain access, the goal of the attacker is to actually try to escalate our privileges of an account so that we can gain complete control of the target. Now, an example of different mechanisms and technologies we can use for gaining access would include things like, again, doing a buffer overflow, DOS, password hacking, session hijacking. I can even go through and stop a service, and stopping that service could actually open up a vulnerability. One of the things that attackers might try to do is something called spoofing, which we talked about earlier kind of with the daisy chaining concepts, and that is they'll actually try to attack a system by pretending or making that target or that system think that it's a different system or even a different user altogether. Or they might even use something like a Smurf attack, which we'll get into a little bit later on. It's not blue, it's not tiny, and there's no Papa Smurf. Just know that that's a mechanism that we can use to get in. So once I made my way in, my next step is, as an attacker, is to actually maintain access. And how we're going to do that is we're going to go, first of all, and make sure that we call it pwning the system. And you've probably heard me say that a couple times. You'll probably hear me say it all the time. It's just kind of a habit of mine. I pwned. You got pwned, or I pwned that machine. This is a slang term that we use. It's used in the IT, or I should say the technology field. It actually came from the gaming side. I can't remember the name of the game, but somebody fat-fingered a message that would pop up when you killed an opponent. It was supposed to say you owned Soldier 5. And obviously the O and the P keys are very close to each other, and so somebody fat-fingered that one. And so it's become a joke in the industry that we pronounce it, or we say pwning instead of owning a system. But that's my goal, is to maintain access. I'm going to totally pwn the system out. And I'm going to then use this system as a launch pad into what I really want to try to accomplish. Now, I could use this system not only to do my attacks, but maybe I use this system to finish scanning out or footprinting your environment. Maybe after I get into this machine, I'm going to install Wireshark and I start sniffing the network and send results back to my location. So I might also, as an attacker, install some Trojans or install a Trojan to do things like steal usernames, passwords, maybe scan for documents that include certain number sequences that might be recognized as Social Security numbers or credit card numbers. But again, this machine that I'm trying to maintain access with may not actually be my target. This could be just something that I'm going to use the resources. I'm going to use the CPU cycles. I'm going to use its bandwidth. I'm going to use it to impersonate me to actually do my dirty work for me. And here's what's really interesting is that a good attacker will actually harden up this machine. What do you mean by that, Dale? Well, what I mean is that if I've gone through all the work of getting into this machine and I pwned it completely, I don't want somebody else to get in the same way. That's why I like to inject my own backdoors or my own Trojans. So I'll actually go through and harden up the system so that all those vulnerabilities are now gone, because I'm going to get in through a different mechanism that's going to be a little bit easier for me. So technically a machine that gets hit by an attacker sometimes is patched up really nicely for you. Now, some of the things that you could do to try to stop this, and we'll get into this when we get into the maintaining course or maintaining access course, but you could install as a security expert, you'd want to install something like a honeypot or a honeynet. These are basically fake systems as well as fake networks to attract a user, an attacker, I should say. And he gets in there and he's spending all of his time. Remember I told you, what was your responsibility? To distract and slow them down. Well, if I put you into a honeypot, maybe I'm actually tracking information about what you're doing and from where, and you're wasting all your time on this fake target or possibly a fake network. Clearing tracks. This is the fifth and kind of the final stage of what an attacker goes through. So he's gotten into the system, he's totally pwned it. Next thing he wants to do is actually cover up his tracks so that people don't see what you've been doing, or these are not the drones you were looking for. This system was never compromised, right? So I'm going to do that several different ways. I'm going to make sure I destroy any proof that I was in there. I'm going to go through and get rid of entries inside of some log files. I might actually delete the log. There's actually two different types of attackers out there. There's the famous saying is that there's the attacker that everybody knows, he has a reputation, and then there's the attacker that nobody knows. And that's the one you're scared of because he's actually hiding stuff. An attacker that everybody knows, meaning he gets his own reputation out there, he might go through and just delete the log files. Well, that can be very easily tracked because the first entry in a log file when you delete it is it was deleted. A great attacker will actually go through and just remove out of the log his particular entries. I'm also going to go through, we talked a little bit earlier about installing our own stuff, but I don't want people to see that I've actually installed my stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and install a rootkit, which helps to hide my tools. Another way that I can hide my stuff is using something called steganography, where I can use things like, an audio file, maybe an MP3, and hide my stuff inside of the MP3, or even inside of an image, maybe a JPEG image. Technically, I can actually use it's called the white space, which are the unused bits in a TCP header. I can hide information inside of those as well. And once I've done that, then this particular box ends up becoming what we refer to as a cyber blind. I'm sure you can figure out what that means, right? If you guys are familiar with a duck blind, what's a duck blind? Yeah, it's some place that you hide behind so the ducks come in when you're duck hunting. So an attacker can actually use the system as a cover or a blind to launch new attacks without being detected. Now, there's several different countermeasures that you can use to help keep track of what's going on and to stop these type of actions. But yes, you guessed it, we're going to save that for another course. So in this module, we went through and took a look at the 5 different phases that an attacker goes through. He first starts off with doing some recon. Again, remember, there's both active and passive versions of reconning. Our purpose, again, at this phase is to gather as much information as possible without being detected. We then go through and start scanning, trying to discover. This gets a little, scanning has a tendency of being a little bit more active instead of passive, but there are passive mechanisms. But our purpose here is to try to map out, identify your network. We then go through and try to gain access to those targets, or to at least a target. Once we've gained access, our next job is to go through and maintain access. Again, typically an attacker will go through, harden up the system so that nobody else can get into it, doesn't want to waste his hard work. Plus, also, I want to make it easier for myself the next time I need to get into this machine. And then finally, we talked about clearing our tracks, cleaning up after ourselves, making sure that nobody can see that we were in. We don't want people, after all that hard work that we went through, we want to make sure that nobody detects it, reimages the machine, or patches it, or whatever. I don't want them to see that. And again, going back to that recon and scanning phase, before I pick my target that I'm going to use, I'm going to make sure it's a machine that is probably not looked at too closely. For example, I'm not going to necessarily hit a server up as my target initially. My first machine into your network is going to be something like, a great example would be maybe it's a computer system that handles your phone systems. Had a company that they had a computer that maintained their logs for their salesmen, their outbound calls, their inbound calls, how many calls they were making each day so they could hold their salespeople accountable. Well, guess what? This program that they were using was so old that it was still running on Windows XP. That was only running Service Pack 1 because Service Pack 2 had some issues with this application. And you'll never guess what we found on that box. So now that you understand our different hacking phases, next up we're going to go through and talk about the attack types.